You stopped. But what if that tells you something about them you are not ready to hear yet? It was not a strategy you designed in a calm moment of self-awareness, executed with the precision of someone who it happened more organically than that, and more painfully, or from a specific moment when something, the full picture of what was actually otherwise anymore. The one initiating calculated the appropriate interval would not seem too much. How much to say? How available to appear? Interior to let show? And how much to someone who had given you no? Of wanting to be overwhelmed, not the calculation, running it while already knowing that the numbers were not adding up in your favor. Not because you chose to with a clear head. The specific combination of the two that the chase required. The reaching simply did not happen. They reached out. They made the gesture. Specific where you had always been there. Like the thing you had been trying to produce through all that effort, something the scripts about this situation rarely name honestly. It is not simple validation, psychologically, of having been right. You got from stopping is not quite, and the question living. You are circling without quite landing on, about them, about what the chase was really for, and whether what is happening, different version, favorable costume, but they are the ones worth answering. The situation actually deserves. We have to be genuinely honest about why you were chasing in the first place, and suddenly they started. You were not planning to stop, not a deliberate withdrawal, understood what they were doing and why. The stopping came from exhaustion, in you finally registered, happening and could not pretend. You had been the one reaching, the one who found reasons to make contact, and after which reaching out again, you had been doing the emotional arithmetic of the pursuit, how long to wait, how much of your actual manage back into invisibility, so as not to overwhelm. Reliable indication the arithmetic was exhausting itself, but the specific weight of somewhere underneath the hope, and then you stopped because you ran out of something. Energy. Hope, and in the absence of that fuel, and in the specific silence that followed, something shifted. They sent the message. They noticed that you were no longer there and their response to that noticing looked from the outside. And now you are sitting with something complicated, because the feeling is not pure relief. It is something more mixed and more significant than the satisfaction. It is the specific recognition that what you thought stopping would give you, underneath all of it, the one, is what any of this actually means about you, and what the silence revealed. Now is actually what you wanted, or simply of the same dynamic wearing a more. These are not comfortable questions, and this video is going to answer them with the level of honesty. Before we can understand what happened when you stopped, not the surface reason, the attraction, the history, the specific quality of their presence that made the effort feel worth the cost. Those reasons are real, but they are not the whole story. They are the visible layer. Underneath them is something that most conversations about this pattern never reach, because going there requires a kind of honesty that the romantic frame of pursuit actively resists. Carl Jung spent decades studying the psychology of what draws one person to chase another with a persistence that does not match the available evidence of reciprocity. What he found was not simply a story of attraction. It was a story about need, a very specific, very old, very deeply installed kind of need that the pursuing person often does not recognize as need because it presents itself in the costume of connection and care. The pattern goes back further than this relationship, not always to childhood in the dramatic therapeutic sense, but always to the earlier formation of what the pursuing person learned to associate with love, specifically what they learned love costs. Whether love arrives freely or only in response to effort, whether the people who were supposed to care did so reliably, or whether their care was something that had to be earned and re-earned and maintained through an ongoing performance of worthiness. The person who chases with consistency in the face of inconsistent return is almost always a person for whom love and effort became fused at an age when the fusion happened without consent, not consciously, through the repeated experience of giving in order to receive, through the environment that taught them, in ways too subtle and too pervasive to identify at the time, that presence required purchase. That attention was a response to performance rather than a baseline. That care had to be earned continuously, or it would withdraw, and so the chase felt like love, the effort felt like depth. The fact that you were working so hard felt like evidence that what you were working toward was real and significant and worth the cost. What it was actually evidence of is something both more painful and more useful to understand. It was evidence of a belief so deeply installed that it had stopped being identifiable as a belief and had begun to feel like simply the way things are. The belief that you need to earn it, that you are not the kind of person love arrives toward without. The engine of your effort running behind it, that the relationship would only move if you moved it. And this belief, not them, not the specific individual you were pursuing, this belief is what the chase was actually perpetuating. They were the context. The belief was the cause. Understanding this does not make you feel better immediately, but it begins to locate the actual work in a place where the actual work can be done. Here is the perspective that most conversations about this situation refuse to name directly, because naming it requires dismantling something that felt meaningful and replacing it with something true. Your pursuit was not communicating what you thought it was communicating. You thought it was communicating interest, care, investment, the specific qualities of someone who recognizes something worth their effort and is willing to give that effort without being asked. And in your interior, those things were genuinely present. But communication is not simply what you intend to send. It is what the other person receives, and what consistent pursuit from one direction communicates to the person. Receiving it is something different from care. It communicates certainty. The certainty that you are there, that you will continue to be there, that the availability is essentially guaranteed regardless of what they do or do not do in response to it. And certainty in the specific psychological register of attraction and genuine interest is not what produces those things. Certainty is what dissolves them. Not because the person receiving the pursuit is deliberately cruel, not because they have consciously calculated that withholding reciprocity will maintain your interest, but because the nervous system that governs attraction does not respond to guaranteed presence the way it responds to uncertain presence. It responds to what requires something, what demands engagement because the alternative is loss, what is moving rather than stable, what could go. Your pursuit, however genuine its origins, was communicating to their nervous system exactly the message their nervous system needed to not have to work, that you were not going anywhere, and the system that registers what requires effort and what does not registered you accurately, not cruelly, simply accurately, as something that did not require effort. This is not a criticism of you. It is a description of how the machinery works. The machinery does not have ethics. It does not evaluate the quality of the person chasing or the fairness of the response. It produces. It simply calculates what costs something versus what does not, and it orients toward cost. Your availability, offered freely and consistently in the absence of reciprocal investment, removed the cost. And in removing the cost, you inadvertently removed the response the cost would have generated. The pursuit was working against the very thing it was trying to produce. Not because you were wrong to feel what you felt, because you were using the wrong instrument to communicate it. Carl Jung introduced a concept that changes almost everything about how this pattern is understood when it is applied to it with full seriousness. He called it the projection of the anima, or animus. The anima is the interior feminine counterpart that exists in the male psyche. The animus is the interior masculine counterpart that exists in the female psyche. These are not about gender in the social performance sense. They are about the interior counterpart, the unlived, undeveloped, unintegrated side of the self that gets projected outward onto specific individuals in the external world, in the specific form of idealized attraction. When you encountered the person you were chasing, something happened in the encounter that went beyond ordinary attraction. Something clicked. Something felt immediately familiar in a way that ordinary familiarity does not explain. There was a quality to their presence that felt like recognition, like something you had been looking for without knowing you were looking. Jung would say that what you experienced in that recognition was not the person themselves. It was the projection of your own interior counterpart landing on them, your anima or animus, the unlived inner other, the ideal that the unconscious has been carrying as a possibility, shaped by the earliest figures who seemed to embody what was missing or longed for in the self, found a compatible screen in this person, and the projection landed with a completeness and an intensity that made the connection feel more significant than any ordinary encounter. This is the first critical piece of information. The chase contains that most people never receive. You were not simply chasing a person. You were chasing your own projected interior. You were chasing the completeness that the interior counterpart represents. The feeling of being whole, of having the missing piece present, of the longing finally arriving at its destination. This is why the intensity of the attraction did not match the evidence of the actual relationship. This is why the pull was stronger than what was being offered could account for. The real pull was toward the projection, not toward them specifically. And this means something crucial about what would actually have happened if the pursuit had succeeded. What you would have gotten would not have been the completion the projection promised. You would have gotten a person, complex, inconsistent, with their own wounds and their own limits and their own interior world entirely separate from the ideal you were actually chasing. The projection would have lifted, as projections always eventually do, and beneath it would have been an ordinary human being who was never capable of providing what the projection made them appear to offer. Jung said this not to counsel against love. He said it because the projection, when it is not recognized as such, drives behavior like the chase that is organized around securing something the external person was never actually holding, and recognizing it changes the nature of what you are actually pursuing. From them specifically, to the interior integration that would make their absence stop feeling like the loss of something essential. Now let us bring in the research, because the psychological mechanism behind what happened when you stopped is not mysterious, it is documented. Psychologists call it psychological reactance, a theory developed in the 1960s by Jack Brame that describes a specific motivational state that arises in people when they perceive that a freedom they previously had is being restricted or removed. In the context of relationships, your consistent availability had become, over time, an assumed given in their psychological landscape, not an explicit expectation, not something they consciously articulated to themselves, but something their system had simply registered as present, and therefore as background. When you stopped, the background shifted. The assumed given was no longer assumed, and the system that governs motivation, the one that responds not to what is stable, but to what is suddenly uncertain, activated in the direction of the thing that had just become uncertain. They reached out, not because they had newly discovered something in you that they had not previously valued. They reached out because their psychological freedom, the freedom to have access to your availability whenever they wanted it, was suddenly in question. The reactance response is not a feeling of love. It is a feeling of wanting to restore what was removed. It is the psychological equivalent of grabbing something from the counter right before. Someone takes it away, not because you were particularly attached to it a moment ago, but because the imminent loss has suddenly made it matter in a way it did not when it was simply there. This is not cynical. It is honest, and the honest version of what happened when you stopped is more complicated than the gratifying narrative suggests. They did not suddenly see you. They suddenly experienced the absence of something they had not been valuing, but had been counting on, without knowing they were counting on it. These are different events, and the difference between them matters enormously when you are deciding what to do with their renewed attention. But here is where the map gets more specific and more personal, because the psychological reactance of the other person is only one part of what happened when you stopped. The other part happened inside you, and this part is the one that matters more, even though it receives less attention in most conversations about this dynamic. When you genuinely stopped, not as a strategy, not with one eye still watching for their response, but actually stopped because you ran out of the specific fuel that the chase was running on, something shifted in your nervous system in a way that was not immediately comfortable, but that was nonetheless significant. The specific state that the pursuit produced in your body was not a peaceful one, even when you were convinced the pursuit was necessary or meaningful. The anxious monitoring, the checking, the interpretation of every silence, every delay, every shift in tone as potential information about how you were landing, the chronic low-level activation of a nervous system that has attached its sense of safety to an external variable it cannot control. When you stopped feeding that system, not because you suddenly became enlightened, but because you ran out of the belief that feeding it would produce anything different from what it had already produced. And in the absence of the feeding, something quieter emerged. Not immediately, not dramatically, but genuinely. The specific flatness of someone who has been in a state of sustained activation and has finally stopped. It is not a pleasant feeling initially. Flatness is not peace, but it is the necessary predecessor to peace in a way that the activation state never is. Jung described this as the withdrawal of libido from the projective state. When the projection is still active, all the psychic energy flows outward toward the person carrying the projected ideal. When the projection begins to loosen, when the exhaustion of the pursuit runs the fuel low enough that the projection cannot maintain its intensity, the energy begins to withdraw, to come back, to return to the person it originally belonged to. That return is disorienting. It sometimes feels like loss, even when it is the beginning of recovery, because what returns with the energy is the full weight of what was spent on the projection, rather than on the interior life. And sitting with that full weight, for the first time without the distraction of the pursuit, is what the stillness after stopping actually is. Here is the uncomfortable truth about what their renewed interest reveals, and I want to say this with care, because the discomfort is not in the saying, but in what the saying might require you to do with what you have been offered. Their reaching out in response to your stopping is not the same as them becoming the person you were hoping the pursuit would eventually produce. It is the reactance response in action, the motivational activation toward something that has become uncertain. But it is also simultaneously real. They did reach out. They did notice. They did experience something when your availability withdrew that they were not experiencing before. The question is not whether that something is real. It is whether that something is sufficient, whether the quality of interest generated by your absence is the quality of interest that can sustain the kind of relationship you were actually seeking when you started the pursuit. Reactance-generated interest tends to have a specific quality. It is urgent in proportion to the uncertainty, and it diminishes in proportion to the restoration of certainty, which means that if you respond to their renewed attention by returning to the pattern of consistent availability, by being there in the specific way that felt safe to them before, the interest that they're noticing produced is likely to reduce in proportion to how safe your return makes them feel. This is not a manipulation to be engineered around. It is a structural description of what reactance-generated interest tends to do when the condition that generated it is removed. If what they experienced in your absence was genuinely something deeper than reactance, if your stopping generated in them a genuine reckoning with what they had been taking for granted rather than simply the activation of a motivational state around a removed freedom that will reveal itself through behavior that does not diminish once your uncertainty is resolved, through consistency rather than urgency, through their initiating rather than simply responding, through the specific quality of care that costs them something rather than simply reassuring them that what they had been assuming was still available. You will be able to tell the difference, but only if you do not return immediately in the same form before the difference has had time to reveal itself. And now I need to stay in the difficult place for a moment, because what I am about to say is not the comfortable part, and the discomfort is precisely the point. The burden of what you have been carrying through this entire process is real, and it deserves to be named honestly before we move toward anything that sounds like resolution. You were the one who was trying. You were the one who brought genuine feeling and genuine effort and genuine openness to a dynamic that did not reciprocate with the same quality or consistency. That asymmetry is real. The cost you paid for your end of it is real. The specific grief of having invested significantly in something that did not invest equivalently back is not something a single reframe or a single psychological explanation dissolves. Understanding why the pattern operated the way it did does not undo the months or years of carrying the specific loneliness of being the one who cared more. Understanding projection does not eliminate the real feeling of having wanted something specific from a specific person and not receiving it. These things coexist. The map and the grief coexist. The insight and the wound coexist. And the most honest thing I can tell you about that coexistence is that it is supposed to be uncomfortable. That the discomfort is not evidence that you have not understood enough or processed enough or moved far enough past it. The discomfort is the accurate response to something that was genuinely hard. What changes with understanding is not the feeling. What changes is the story you tell yourself about what the feeling means. Before the understanding, the feeling meant something was wrong with you, that you were not enough, that you chased because you were deficient in something that would have made the reciprocity come naturally, that the asymmetry was a verdict on your worth. After the understanding, the feeling is allowed to be exactly what it is. Grief about a real loss, not a verdict, not a diagnosis. Grief, which is what you were always feeling anyway, but are now finally allowed to feel without the additional weight of it, meaning something catastrophic about who you are. There is a question underneath all of this that the pursuit was asking on your behalf, and that the pursuit itself could never answer. The question is not whether this specific person is capable of the kind of reciprocity you need. That is a secondary question. The primary question The one the pattern keeps circling is whether you are capable of receiving reciprocity when it arrives freely, without having earned it through effort, without the specific texture of the chase that made the connection feel real, without the particular quality of difficulty that the pursuit produced, and that, without your conscious awareness of it, had become your primary evidence that something significant was at stake. Because here is what the pattern reveals. When you look at it with full honesty about the interior architecture that produced it, the person who consistently pursues others who do not reciprocate has almost always developed, through experience rather than through choice, a tolerance for the texture of difficult love that they have not developed for the texture of easy love. Easy love, freely given, consistently available, not requiring the pursuit to generate or maintain, can feel, to someone whose interior has been shaped by the alternative, like something other than love, like it must not be real enough, like it must not mean as much, like the absence of the work required to produce. It is evidence that it is somehow cheaper than what the work produces, even when what the work produces is also, and this is the part that requires the most honest examination, not actually love in the form that nourishes. It is the performance of the conditions under which love, in the original environment that installed the pattern, occasionally arrived. It is not love itself. It is love's costume worn by a pattern the nervous system has learned to treat as home. Jung called this the confusion of familiarity with connection, the specific interior architecture that mistakes the texture of difficulty for the depth of meaning. And recognizing it is not a small thing. It is the beginning of the only work that actually changes what you will find yourself pursuing the next time the pattern activates. Now let us go to the origin, because the pattern does not appear in adulthood without having been installed somewhere earlier. Not always in the dramatic way. Not always through overt neglect or identifiable harm. Sometimes through the much subtler and much more pervasive experience of growing up in an environment where love and availability were real but inconsistent, where the adults who were supposed to provide reliable warmth were themselves carrying unresolved material that made their warmth subject to their interior weather, rather than to your need for it, where you learned not through a single lesson, but through the slow accumulation of experiences that care had a conditional quality, that it arrived more reliably when you were performing certain things and less reliably when you were not, that your needs could be met if you timed them correctly, calibrated them carefully, and presented them in the form most likely to generate a response. This is not an accusation against the people who raised you. It is a description of an extremely common developmental experience that produces an extremely common adult pattern. What it installed in you was not broken. It was functional. It was a survival strategy assembled by a younger self that was genuinely working with limited options in a real environment with real constraints. The problem is that functional survival strategies do not automatically retire when the original environment is no longer the current one. They continue running because they were never explicitly decommissioned. The pursuit of people who do not reciprocate is, in many cases, the adult expression of a child's attempt to earn the consistent care that was originally available only in response to performance. It is the old strategy in a new context, loyal to a past that has already ended, but running as though that past was still the present. Jung's contribution to understanding this is not simply the identification of the pattern. It is the prescription for what changes it. He called it making the unconscious conscious, not in a single dramatic moment of insight, but in the sustained, daily, frequently unglamorous practice of noticing when the old strategy is activating in a new context and asking gently, without judgment, but with genuine curiosity, whether the current environment actually requires what the original one did, whether the current person you are orienting toward is actually withholding what the original figures withheld, or whether they are simply living their own life in ways that your pattern is interpreting through the lens of that original experience. The question does not produce immediate change, but the habit of asking it begins over time to introduce a degree of space between the old pattern's activation and your automatic response to it. And in that space, something genuinely different becomes possible. Here is how you tell the difference between their interest being genuine and their interest being reactive, because this question is the practical one, the one you are actually trying to answer, and it deserves a specific and honest response rather than a philosophical one. Reactive interest has a specific texture. It is urgent at the point of uncertainty, and it reduces as the uncertainty resolves. It produces behavior that does not require your scarcity to maintain its energy. It asks questions that are not oriented toward securing your availability, but toward knowing something real about your actual interior. It is willing to be uncomfortable in the direction of the relationship, rather than simply comfortable in the restoration of a status quo it found reassuring. None of this can be determined from a single message or a single gesture, or a single week of their response to your stopping. The difference between reactive and genuine is visible over time, across multiple instances, in the pattern of their behavior when the initial urgency of their noticing has had time to settle into whatever it is actually made of. You have been running the comparison between what they offered during the chase and what they offered before it. The more useful comparison is between what they offer in the days and weeks immediately after their noticing, and what they offer when the novelty of the noticing has passed and the ordinary conditions of a real relationship would require something more sustained than urgency. What actually changed in you when you stopped is not the external dynamic, though the external dynamic did change. What changed in you is more important than what changed in them, and it is also the thing most conversations about this moment entirely skip because the external change is more dramatic and more immediately satisfying to report. When you stopped, you gave yourself the first extended experience in this relationship of not organizing your interior around their response, not waiting for the message, not interpreting the silence, not calibrating how much of yourself to show based on what you calculated was most likely to produce the reaction you needed. For the first time in however long the pursuit had been running, your interior was not occupied by the management of it, and in that unoccupied space, which felt initially like emptiness, but was actually something closer to availability, you became, gradually, more present to your own actual experience, not their experience of you, your experience of yourself. The specific things you wanted that had nothing to do with them, the directions your energy wanted to move in when it was not being channeled entirely toward the chase. The quality of your own company, which you had not had much uncontaminated access to during the period when the pursuit was running. This is not a small thing. It is, in Jung's framework, the beginning of the withdrawal of projection, the anima or animus, the interior counterpart that had been living entirely in the person you were pursuing begins to come home, not dramatically, not all at once, in the specific quiet, unglamorous way of energy that no longer has an external destination and therefore has to find somewhere interior to land. That landing is the beginning of the only kind of individuation that actually addresses what the pattern was originally trying to solve, not through securing the external source of completion, but through developing the interior relationship with the part of yourself that the projection had been carrying outward. The three specific interior shifts that change this pattern permanently, not temporarily, not for this relationship, but in the deeper structural way that changes what you find yourself pursuing in the next situation, and the one after that, are worth naming precisely because the pattern does not simply disappear with understanding. It requires practice to change. The first shift is the practice of noticing the activation before acting on it. The next time you encounter someone who produces the specific feeling of recognition, the pull, the click, the sense of something familiar and necessary, pause before organizing your behavior around the pursuit of it, not to suppress the feeling, to notice it with full honesty and ask the question Jung kept returning to. What am I actually recognizing? Is this person genuinely what the recognition suggests? Or is this my own interior counterpart landing on them because they share some quality with the figure who originally shaped that counterpart? You will not always be able to answer the question immediately, but the habit of asking it before you act creates the space in which a different kind of engagement becomes possible. The second shift is the practice of investing in directions that produce the feeling of aliveness without requiring another person's response to sustain it, not as a substitute for connection, as the foundation that makes connection from a different position possible. When your primary source of aliveness is interior, generated by your own work, your own presence to your own experience, your own development of the things that make your interior rich, enough to be genuinely interesting to inhabit, you bring something different to the next significant encounter. You bring someone who is not running on the need to be completed, someone whose presence in a relationship is an offering rather than an extraction, someone who can receive freely given care without the specific suspicion that what is freely given is somehow worth less than what was earned through effort. The third shift is the most demanding and the most important. It is the practice of staying in situations where care arrives freely and without the texture of difficulty long enough to let the nervous system learn that it is safe, to let the old association between ease and cheapness begin to loosen, to give your interior the repeated, embodied experience of receiving without having first performed, not once, many times, across enough instances that the nervous system's calculation shifts from easy. Love is not real love to easy love is the only kind that is actually love. This shift does not happen through understanding it intellectually. It happens through staying in the easy thing long enough to let the anxiety about its being insufficient resolve into the recognition that it is not insufficient at all. It is simply unfamiliar, and unfamiliar and insufficient are two entirely different things. There is something their renewed interest cannot give you, and naming it directly is important, because the temptation to seek it from them anyway is real and will not diminish, simply because you understand the psychology of why it will not work. What their renewed interest cannot give you is the resolution of the original wound, the wound that the projection was organized around, the original experience of love that was conditional or inconsistent or available only in response to performance. That wound does not heal through the eventual reciprocation of someone who originally withheld. It heals through something that has nothing to do with them and that they are not capable of providing even if they try, because they were never the source of it and they are not the solution to it. What heals it is the specific, sustained, interior experience of being responded to by yourself first, and then gradually by people who are capable of consistent and freely given care, not in response to the performance of worthiness, but simply in response to your presence. The experience of being enough without the engine of effort running behind it. This experience cannot be produced by this person, not because they are inadequate, because they are the wrong kind of medicine for the specific illness. They are the medicine that produces a temporary relief of the symptom while leaving the underlying condition unchanged. And the underlying condition, the old belief that love requires the chase, that care must be earned, that the texture of difficulty is evidence of depth, that condition requires a different intervention than the one their renewed attention can provide. Jung was precise about this. He did not say the external relationship was unimportant. He said that the external relationship, however significant, could not do the interior work. The interior work could only be done interior, by the person whose interior it is, in the specific daily practice of attending to what is actually there rather than managing it into the shape most likely to produce a desired external response. Here is what you do now, not with them, with yourself. The first thing is to allow yourself to feel whatever you are actually feeling about their renewed interest without immediately converting it into a decision. The specific mixture of satisfaction and suspicion and hope and wariness that their reaching out has produced is not a problem requiring an immediate resolution. It is a real and complicated emotional response to a real and complicated situation, and giving it the dignity of being felt before it is acted on is itself a practice different from what the chase required. The chase required constant action, constant response to the external stimulus. The work that comes after the chase requires something more like witnessing, noticing what is there before you know what to do with it. The second thing is to identify as precisely as you can what specifically you want from this person. Not the projection, not the feeling they produce, not the ideal they represent. What you actually want from this specific, ordinary, complicated human being. What you would need to see from them, across what time frame, to feel that what they are offering now is something real rather than something reactive. Write it down if that helps, not as a test to administer, but as a way of giving yourself clarity about what you are actually evaluating, rather than simply responding to the warmth of their contact and discovering later whether the warmth was real or whether it was simply the specific heat generated by proximity to something that was briefly uncertain. The third thing is to be genuinely willing to discover either answer, to be willing to find that their interest is reactive and will diminish as the uncertainty resolves, and to hold that finding without it becoming a new evidence point for the old wound, and to be equally willing to find that something genuine was produced by the distance that your stopping created the specific condition under which they were able to encounter something real about what your presence had been providing, and to receive that finding without immediately reverting to the availability that will test its durability before it has had time to establish itself. Carl Jung wrote about the moment, the projection lifts with a specific and rare kind of care. He described it as both a loss and a liberation. A loss because the projection carried such intensity, such aliveness, such a sense of something enormous and necessary, that its reduction inevitably feels like the diminishment of something real. A liberation because what remains when the projection withdraws is the actual person, not the ideal. The actual person, visible for perhaps the first time, in all of their ordinary and complicated and genuinely interesting humanness, and what becomes possible between two actual people, two people who are no longer relating primarily through the screen of each other's projected ideals. It's something that projection, for all its intensity, was never capable of producing. It is quieter, it is less dramatic, it lacks the specific electricity of the chase, and the specific urgency of the reactance, and the specific significance of the recognition. But it has something those things never had. It has the specific quality of being real, of being about the actual person rather than about what the actual person was carrying on behalf of your unconscious. Jung considered this the beginning of genuine love, rather than the end of the romantic version. Not the intensification of the feeling, but the appearance of the actual. Not the projection sustaining itself, but the person beneath the projection becoming visible and remaining interesting after the projection has lifted. Whether that is possible between you and the person you stopped chasing is something neither psychology nor this video can tell you. It is something only the unfolding of actual behavior across actual time will eventually reveal. But what this moment has given you, regardless of what they choose to do with it, is something that would not have been available if the chase had simply continued until it succeeded or failed on the original terms. It has given you the first clear view of the pattern that was running underneath it, and a clear view of the pattern is the only thing that makes a different pattern genuinely possible. The question that stays after all of this, the one that this video cannot resolve for you, the one that only your own honest interior attention can eventually answer, is not whether they are worth pursuing now that the dynamic has shifted. That question will answer itself through their behavior over time. The question that stays is the deeper one, the one the chase was always circling without quite reaching. Whether the version of you that existed before the pursuit began, the one who did not yet know this specific person or carry the specific weight of this specific dynamic, whether that version of you would recognize the version that has emerged from it as someone who has learned something real, not something flattering, something true about what love requires, about what the texture of difficulty actually indicates, about the difference between the feeling of recognition and the presence of something genuine about who you have been chasing. When you have been chasing people who do not come toward you, you know the answer. You have known it for longer than the stopping required to make it undeniable. The question is not whether you know it. The question is whether you are ready to live from it, starting now, in the specific ordinary moment of whatever comes next, which is also always exactly the right moment for the work to begin.